All right. So I will get started. We're running a little bit behind, so just so that we have time to hopefully get through a lot of this, I want to welcome everybody who is in the room, who can hear the sound of my voice. Welcome back to the second day of the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. We are excited to welcome new participants, as well as those of you who are able to attend our conference last week. If you weren't able to attend last week, just know that most of the presentations were recorded and will be available on our conference. The ones last week, most of those are available on the conference website now, and then the ones this week will be available at a future date. So I'm Bethany Matson. I am happy to be here for this breakout presentation titled "Are African American Men Deserving of the American Dream?" with Dr. David J. Pate. So we would like to encourage everybody to stick around after the presentation for our closing panel featuring Dr. Brown, Jacqueline Boges, and Sakara Wages. And so I will put a link in the panel at the end of this presentation, so you can easily find your way there. So don't worry if you don't have to go searching for it. I'll provide that for everybody to have as we close out. Since this is the start of the conference for the day, just want to open it up before we get started. It's important to take a moment to honor Indigenous people through the university's land acknowledgement. So UW-Madison and the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work occupy ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Tejope since time immemorial. In 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. So we just want to do that, and hopefully I did justice to that statement. I will, just a couple of other quick housekeeping details. This presentation is being recorded and again will be available at a later date. To access the presentation, you were required to provide your name and email. This allows us to log all the attendees and email your information on CEUs for this presentation. So those will come at a later date. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted. And then finally, please use the Q&A section for questions. As we go along, I will give those questions to Dr. Pate to answer. So please use the Q&A if you have questions, and we will try to get to those. If I miss one or we don't get to it, please charge it to our head, not our hearts. We want to try to get to everybody, but I can't make any promises that we will be able to do that in this time. And so without further ado, I just want to take a second to introduce Dr. Pate. So Dr. Pate is an associate professor and chair of the social work department at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in the Helen Bader School of Social Welfare, and an affiliated associate professor in the Department of Africology. I butchered that. And an affiliated associate professor at the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a faculty affiliate of the Institute for Child and Wellbeing at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Professor Pate's research projects involve examining the life course of Black adult males through the use of qualitative research methods. His primary areas of interest are the child support enforcement policy, infant mortality, and the impact of adverse childhood experiences on the well-being status of Black males. So once again, welcome, Dr. Pate, and we are excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Bethany, and I want to say welcome to everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your busy day to come listen to my presentation, which is a work in progress, as Bethany and Liz will know. Just a minute before we got on, I was still working on my presentation. I was still thinking of what I was going to say, and this particular presentation has been a work in progress for literally a year. I'm hoping to write a paper from it, but also do talk in March about the same topic. So I appreciate any comments, any criticisms, and if you have any questions, please feel free to stop and ask Bethany what's going on. So let me progress with slides. So again, I want to thank all of those. I want to thank the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work Planning Committee for inviting me to the 7th Annual Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference, especially Angela Wiltz, which I think I butchered her name, Liz Primo, and Bethany Matson. And Bethany did a wonderful job saying Africology. You were right on spot. I also want to thank all of the people listed here whom are alive or no longer with us, who were very instrumental in making me think about what does it mean when I say, do Black men deserve the American dream? I've read many of their works. I've talked to some of them. I'm using some photography from Carlos Javier Ortiz, who is a Guggenheim Fellow, whose work has been seen in many museums around the world, but also is something I came to first know of his work with Ta-Nehisi Coates when his work was featured in The Atlantic on looking at just Black lives in Chicago. So I want to thank everybody here for being scholars who have helped me to think about what does it mean when I say, do Black men deserve the American dream, particularly when you look at the social welfare system. The other thing I want to highlight before we get started is some of my goals here. One of the explicit goals of this particular conference was to explore the impact of social policies and social services on racial inequities, including the unintended consequences of these policies and services. So I really thought my topic was spot on with that, looking at how do we look at issues of race, gender, and class, and our social welfare system. As Bethany has said in the bio, my work has been only on men since I graduated as a master's student in social work so many years ago that I don't even want to mention how many years it was. I had decided then that I would only look at the provision of services to Black men and Black young boys to figure out what is it about them that makes us so nervous, afraid, hesitant, and not willing to provide them the same citizenship status that so many other people are able to take advantage of in this country who are here. So I'm hoping that this topic and discussion, it allows you to see how that works and doesn't work. In this lecture also, sharing some information from a colleague, Jacqueline Boges in particular, the whole idea of thinking about race, class, and gender is encompassed in some of the things that I think are really important. One, systems of power, or power in particular, really does affect how we interact or treat someone based on how powerful we want to be over them, or how much power we want to use against them, or even in our social welfare system, how powerless we want them to be. And we, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to debate that, we do possess a lot of power as social workers as to whether someone is able to get what they need, whether we deem them as being deserving of what they need, or whether or not we see them as being undeserving. These three fundamental systems that we're looking at here in terms of race, class, and gender also have a significant influence on a number of things, from sexual orientation to identity to education. And particularly now, I'm always challenged and always and amazed at my students who really make sure I reevaluate my own values and thoughts about how people identify themselves as he, she, they, them. My pronouns are he, him, and him, which I've been trying to get that in my language, but you new students really are forcing me to think, and I think it's a good thing. But again, these systems of power are very, very important. I want to make sure that we understand what this particular group that I'm going to talk about, who what I would say is impressed and discriminated against in different ways, has a historical context, and you will get a lot of history, because a lot of the approaches that we take to how we provide social services, or how we look at people as human or as worthy of citizenship, is grounded in the history of our country. And one of the things about February, as everyone knows, is usually called Black History Month, which is a wonderful time to recognize Black excellence. But this history I'm talking to you about today is not just it's not Black history, it's American history. It's American history that's grounded in how we viewed people who were seen as Black and identified as Black and decided to be designated as Black. And I hope that this history lesson, as well as this somewhat critical analysis of our current system, provides you some provide you some interesting ways of thinking about how do I move forward in my own work. One of the things that's really important about this work is historical trauma. I'm sure many of you have already heard this, but it's, again, I don't want to assume anything, but Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart in one of her articles talks about the whole idea of multi-generational trauma. Many of you already know what that means, but it's that based on certain policies, and Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, really pushes us to think about this as well. But you can either be anti-racist or you can be racist, but it's based in how you look at which policies or practices are endorsed that do not allow everyone equal access to citizenship or to the ability to feel included or to have equity. But I want to make sure that what I'm about to talk to you now is about a series of historical trauma events that are specific to Black people. I'm going to at some point narrow it down to Black men in particular, but it's to Black people, people who came over and were identified as Black, Black Africans who were brought here as people who then became enslaved. So if we look even at the basis of our social welfare system, hopefully, if you were in one of my classes in Social Work 206, you heard about this, the whole idea of the Elizabethan Poor Law, and that we in 1601, not we the country, we the world, that was in England, and those who came to this country and colonized it, brought this with them, had decided there was a deserving group of those who were recipients of services, and there was an undeserving group of those who could have services that would help them when they were in times of need, whether that be a mental health crisis or a financial crisis, but some crisis that did not allow them to be able to fulfill their life in a way that was going to be to their advantage. And generally, and under that deserving category, it was decided at that point in 1601 that women and children, those who were disabled, those who had some mental health issues, and those who were elderly were seen as a deserving population. And those who were undeserving was those who were seen as able-bodied, those who were generally men, not always, but predominantly men, were seen as also as a part of that undeserving group, because there's some assumptions that underlie the whole idea of what does it mean to be a man. And at the time, it meant that you could work, you were head of household, you could do anything because farming was available to you. And again, this particular law was developed in the context of a group that was European, because the word Black or the designation of Black had not been a term that had been solidified at that point. But this was about the fact that you were a male who could work. And so it's the assumption that men are able-bodied and should man up or be able to do whatever they need to do to take care of themselves was something that has 400 plus years of culture behind it. So again, that's something to think about as well. So let's start with some of the historical trauma that we need to think about. So in August 1619, that's when we saw the first group of 20 people who were Africans who survived the transatlantic cross to America. They were 20 Africans who became enslaved. They were sold to colonists. And if you haven't had a chance to look at the 1619 Project, the 1619 Project has been, of course, much in the news over the last several months, based on our past presidents' thoughts about it, and also the administration there, that Nicole Hannah-Jones will say, that's when America started. That's when we, as a democracy, decided that we were going to look at a particular group in a different way. Now, that first group of 20 was definitely not handled in the same way, that was not treated in the same way that subsequent groups of Africans were handled, but they were seen as different and as people who could be sold for their labor. So there was that first group of 20 also was given the opportunity, men and women, to be free after a certain period of time. But it was at that point, after they understood their labor could be free, that there was also more discussion about how do we handle this group of people who, or maybe people's not even the right word to use, but how do we handle this group who has come to America, who has been brought to America for their labor, and take advantage of this labor as we move forward. With the whole idea of this 20 group of people who came into America at the time, the exclusivity of whiteness was created. and became a reality. And I want to read from you. I got a book that I'm very happy to be reading. It's called 400 Souls, and I highly recommend it. But the whole idea of what is the exclusivity, excuse me, of whiteness means. I'm gonna read a chapter from the book called "Whipped for Lying with a Black Woman," and it was published for looking at the years from 1629 to 1634. So it's 10 years after we have the arrival of those who were enslaved, and is also at a time when we are now trying to figure out, as a country, what's going on here. So in 1630, as the book reads, the whipping of Hugh Davis, a white man. This is when we just took the whole idea of how important was the concept of race in America into law. Davis was whipped because he had polluted, as they say, or had sex with a Black woman. There was no record of the Black woman in question being punished for polluting herself with whiteness, but Davis was whipped for polluting whiteness, his own and that of his community. This was the first recorded case of its kind in the United States, establishing that whiteness was susceptible to pollution from sexual contact with Blackness, and that pure whiteness must be protected through law. I remember my mother asking me a few years ago, why did I not, this person is talking about their own race, and they said, why did I, their own racial identity? And they said to their mother said to them, I remember my mother asking me a few years ago, why did I not call myself half white? I explained to her, because you cannot become part white. Whiteness is a ledge you can only fall from. And so it was with that we started seeing this whole idea that the first separation of Black from white in the American colonies as an issue of white survival instead of racial preference was real. That people were now concerned that we can't not be identifying ourselves with those who look like this dark skin, with those who are not who we have to decide. I know who also we have to, if you didn't know this, are not Christian, and because they weren't Christian, they didn't look like us, and we had to figure out how do we other someone. The whole idea of legislating whiteness became a real issue at this time, because it was those who saw what we would consider the beginning of a capitalistic society. There is some advantage to taking advantage of someone's labor in order for you to be able to advance yourself. And that's what we have in 1647, the federal laws deeming this whole idea of chattel slavery. And chattel slavery was deeming people of African descent inferior to white people, and defined Black people as commodities who could be brought, sold, insured, willed, and a variety of other things, such as this sign shows here. If you've never seen a poster, those people who were considered Negro at the time, or those who were enslaved, were sold along with those who were males and considered male, or farming tools, or mining tools, or pigs, or whatever grain they would have these published signs saying we're selling people, because this was the way people became white people. Those who identified as white were able to get their money. Males were seen as more important because males provided more labor, free labor. They were stronger. They were able to provide also opportunity if you wanted to have more children along with the woman. The woman was not seen as anything but another piece of like another animal. Therefore, you can have this man and woman engage in intimate activities where you can have more of these animals, as they were considered, to increase your wealth. So again, this whole idea of the American dream had not been fully developed. We'll get to that later. But this whole idea of how you could take advantage of someone else's labor was definitely a real thing. Also, the whole idea of hereditary laws came into place. And again, this is the federal government putting into place, how do we take advantage of someone's labor, particularly someone who is Black, particularly someone who we see or think of them as male or female, or a winch or a buck, as they were called then. So in colonial law, laws were passed that the social status of the mother determined your status as a citizen of this country, even though citizenship had not been fully established at this time. That wasn't until the Declaration of Independence. But at this time, there was still labor that they wanted to take advantage of. And what government was involved by states, because it was state governments that were making these laws, they were deciding, and Virginia was the first state to do that, that anyone who was born of a mother who was enslaved was definitely a slave. Um, and you can make that happen whatever way the master wanted that to happen. It also established that they were legally barred from marrying, they were legally barred from reading, learning to read, meeting privately in groups. They had no claim to their children who could be brought, sold, and traded away at any given time. They had no legal standing. They were able to be raped or murdered with no legal consequences, and they could not own anything. And this is very well articulated in the 1619 Project. And there's a really good podcast if you're not someone who reads, but likes to listen to podcasts. It's an excellent podcast from the 1619 Project that I would highly recommend you go to. So again, if you're looking at how does someone get to where they think they're deserving of the American dream, or that they are in a space where their gender is seen as important or deserving of services, this foundation of what does it mean to be someone in a country where you've been enslaved, but you have no rights, and you have no rights that have lasted for over 250 years. And then at a point, you're expected to be on the same playing field or the same level, the same, and have the same access is something we need to talk about. In 1776, of course, we had the Declaration of Independence. And I'm sure all of you know this, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, again, women were not seen as equal to men, but that men were seen as the head of household and the leaders, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you didn't know, Thomas Jefferson, of all the presidents we had the most slaves of anyone. But he was the same person that also wrote the Declaration of Independence. There was some argument about the Declaration of Independence not including slavery in it and what that meant. So there was some conflict, but it's also known that Thomas Jefferson had many children that were born from his interaction with Sally Hemings, which is the most famous person we know. And for those who don't know this, that in Madison, Wisconsin, one of Thomas Jefferson's children are buried in the cemetery right near West High School. And his son came here identifying as someone as white. His mother's name was Hemings, and he had a fruitful life here as a blacksmith. And you can go definitely, you can see his tombstone and his children's tombstones and his wife's tombstone in the cemetery right near West High School in Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin. Then you have the Constitution that was written in 1787. It also made this whole issue of how we look at a certain group of people in a certain way. It said that there was 84 clauses. 6 of those clauses were solidifying the role of slavery and what it played in our country, and how that there was a group of people who could be enslaved for the purpose of the labor that they wanted to maintain, but also that they were the property of those who were enslaved. Those who were enslaved were property of people who owned them. So again, there was those difficulties as well. So we're kind of moving fast forward here a little bit because I do want to see if there's questions or comments. But in 1865, right after the Civil War, 1863, after the Civil War ended, people have now had the advantage of for 250 years of owning people, Black men, Black women, Black children, and having them do their bidding, and knowing that if they didn't, there were severe consequences for not doing that. So because that was a real issue, there was these states that immediately, Mississippi and South Carolina were the first 2 states that initiated this thing called Black Codes, where they said it was okay for Blacks to get married and own property, and have some limited access to courts, but it denied them the right to be in a courtroom and to serve on a jury. It denied them the right to vote. And it denied them the right to start a job without the approval of their previous employer. But then their previous employer for so many people in the South was their slave owner. And so therefore we saw these issues of sharecropping. People were given land, they were allowed to work on that land, and they were told that land was theirs, but there was a high rent tax for using that land, and that you had to give so much of your crops to the owner. So therefore, at the same time this was going on, I like you to think about the fact that people were also, who were enslaved people, were seeing what roles men and women did play and how men and women did interact with each other. and that they heard of people in the North who were having some of these benefits of having their own families and going to school and doing things that seemed like what you should be able to do in this particular country. But in this particular area of the South, not saying, and I want to highlight, the South was not the only place doing a lot of horrible things to Black people. We'll get to a specific incident in 1919, hopefully. It was called the Red Summer in Chicago, that is very much like you would think you were in the South. But these codes were put into place in 1865. Some of these a lot of these codes were repealed when Reconstruction started. But those, and this is 3 years later, but it was immediately those who were former slave owners and those who were concerned about their power to be able to control men and women, that we see that they wanted to kind of participate in a way that they felt they were participating, but in many ways they really weren't engaging in the whole issue of inclusion and equity that we would like to do. And in the Reconstruction period is when we see some of that one opportunity where you can see things change. They also at this time instituted a vagrancy statute, which made it a crime to be unemployed. And I really want people to think about, how do we treat people today through our social welfare system who are unemployed? How do we look at them, or how do we view them, or how do we decide whether they can have their children or not, or whether or not they should be denied a benefit or not if they're unemployed? Because many of our social welfare policies, if you think about it, are tied to employment, because of the whole idea of reciprocity. If I'm giving you a benefit, you have to do something else. And now there's nothing wrong with making sure people are able to advance and have a career ladder if they're having some issues. But is the career that you're providing them access to, or the opportunities you're providing to them, opportunity that's going to really allow them to increase their economic security and have them live under less stress? But this whole idea of a vagrancy statute that was put into place in 1863 often makes me think about, how far have we come in understanding and appreciating those who have gone through this whole issue of slavery, but also by class, those who are more challenged in their financial security. In 1857, prior to the whole idea of a Reconstruction, there was the Dred Scott decision. And that was a Supreme Court decision also that had some effect on who you were as a citizen who identified as Black. The Dred Scott decision decided that the court ruled that a separation of people was important because the Negroes did not have the same standing as a white person. And so the rights of citizenship were denied under the Constitution in 1857 for those who were Black and formerly, and currently, at this time, slavery was still in existence. But also slavery was in the North, people were who had escaped or who had gone somewhere in other parts of the country. Maybe they went, this particular incident was Missouri, they were now in a free state. But what this rule said, that if a person was deemed as a slave, or they think they were escaping, you can take them back to their owner, their master as they were called. And therefore they were now re-enslaved. And also this decision was somewhat of the foundation for where we have colored fountains and colored theater seating, where you can sit only in certain sections of the trains, and a variety of ways that segregation was promoted because of Supreme Court practices, federal government practices, which were supported. Is there any questions, Brittany? I don't want to keep talking. If there's people have had any questions, I need to stop and answer at the present time.
I don't have audience questions, but I have a question of my own.
Please do.
So and maybe it's not a question, but more of like, and maybe you'll speak to this later, an understanding of how important like knowing this history is, since so much of it are not things that most people hear about. Like, yes. No matter who you are, we don't hear about these things. And so it allows us to separate, what this country actually is to what we see it as. And I wonder if you'll speak to like the impact that does continue to have on people, that we've created this almost like cognitive dissonance of who we are as a country versus what we see ourselves as.
Yeah, really good question. And you made me think about Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, and I was going to read it, and I said, well, I'll talk about it, but I'll talk about it now. One of the things Du Bois said early I think it was 1915, he said, we were already trying to erase the propaganda of history. We're trying to not have people understand that even as recent as 1915, and slavery had only been gone for maybe 40 years at most, 50 years at most. That people were trying to erase that as part of what people who were former enslaved people were dealing with. The whole idea that there was this whole attitude around the fact that people thought, okay, you're now free and we're going to give you what you need, so you should be okay. And we still promote some of that we all are on the same playing field, that we all are able to have the same access to wealth, or that we have wealth, or the accumulation of wealth from our ancestors where we've inherited, so we're able to now have that extra home or the extra benefit. And what he has said is propaganda like this that has led men in the past, that history is lies agreed upon, and to point out the danger in such misinformation. He talks about that in the book Black Reconstruction he wrote in 1935, not 1915. He argued that America had falsified the fact of its history because the nation was ashamed. But he warned it is indeed extremely doubtful if any permanent benefit comes to the world through such action. And one of the things that I constantly remind my students, if we don't know the history, we're more likely to repeat the same problem over and over again. We're allowing ourselves to maintain this issue, we're allowing ourselves to maintain and contribute to the falsification of what America is. And when people say, I just didn't know, and I have to admit, when I hear people even most recently say it's of January 6th, this is not America. Oh, yes, it is America. It's been America since 1619. And we just are now, and one of the things that our former president did do is help us all realize this is America. And we have to now think big. We have a wonderful opportunity to think big, go hard, and decide, what do we want America to look like moving forward? And who are we as a group of people who have opportunities? And even in the field of social work, we're being challenged in the area of child welfare about how we do that work. We're being challenged in the area of child support, which is the work I do, and how we look at race and how we decide how the research is being conducted. We're being challenged in many ways that I think is good. Hopefully, the energy that is seen through a program like a conference like this, that is in the 7th year, will continue, and more schools of social work will do it. But again, your question is right on point, is that because people are not given this history, I do this history in my policy class, because before we talk about policies, you need to understand what's the foundation of who we are. And this is not Black history, this is American history. And this is what has given people the opportunities they have that they don't even understand why they have opportunities. Another good example, did it help, Bethany, or did you need more?
No, for sure. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. So the Homestead Act is another one of these policies that was made available to those who identified as white. That you can take up you can get up to 160 acres of land. You can be charged $18 for it, and you can be on that land for 5 years at minimum, and then it's yours. Now, Black people will be eligible under this particular policy once the 14th Amendment became real, because in 1868, they said that, if you were born on American soil, then you are an American citizen. However, let's think about that. I'm a formerly enslaved person, less than 5 years away from that. I ain't got no money. If I do, where is it? And if I do have some money, you're going to treat me equal. And how am I going to get there? There's people who may be thinking they can still capture me, and they still do. Because some of us, such as people in Texas, didn't even know there was an Emancipation Proclamation for several years. There's still people who don't even know if they have any agency to really move around as a free person. So again, there was these policies in place that helped those who were seen as equal. But again, this policy also only applied to men. So the Homestead Act of 1862 allowed white men to be able to accumulate wealth. And a really good article from Trina Shanks, who's at University of Michigan, and a really good colleague, has written a really great article about this whole idea of the amount of wealth that people have accumulated, which is astronomical, because their families were able to take advantage of this Homestead Act. At the same time, the Homestead Act an issue of displacing Native Americans who were also here. And they were not given any opportunity. They weren't even seen really as American citizens till very recently. So again, we have to think about, we're a country that has based itself on violence and just taking and colonialization of folks. And we don't talk about that because it makes us sad or it makes us unhappy. Well, it's our history and we got to talk about it. Now, the one time in the history of this country where we could look at former African slaves or former enslaved Africans attaining equality was from 1865 to 1877. It was a period of time where the legal status of formerly enslaved people was attained. It was also a time where a number of initiatives were happening that made a difference. The very first social welfare program, if you didn't know this, was the Freedmen's Bureau. It was the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. It wasn't only available to those who were enslaved, but it was created in this democracy because of the number of enslaved people who had no security at all. It was a federal program. It was a mandated federal program to former rebellious states, which was primarily those states in the South. And it was to protect those who were seen as now freed men. So again, men is the emphasis here because women were not seen as equal. What it provided in 4 major programs was food. So it would be like our food stamp program now. They provided healthcare, which would be like our affordable care program right now. It provided educational programs. So schools that were being built, such as Howard and Tuskegee, and also grade schools were created in Mississippi and other states for Blacks to have access to, because up until this time, Blacks were not allowed to have an education. And it also, which was surprisingly, provided Blacks, formerly enslaved Blacks, access to legal services. So, which is like our current legal services now that we provide, not a whole lot of it, but there was these 4 areas or categories that they felt needed to be provided to people in order for them to be able to be seen as citizens of America. Because of the 14th Amendment, they now could be seen citizens of America because they were born here, and they were able to make decisions like, I want to be on the land and make that land my home and build a home there. So this happened, as you can see, for a very short period of time of our history. Because white folks, people in charge at that time, did not agree to that. It was a time where we saw the most Black elected officials, and this is the first 7 elected officials who were part of the Senate. They were part of the Senate. They were the first senator is Hiram Revels, which is the guy on he's to my left with the next to the guy who has a very full beard. And the others were members of the House of Representatives. This is a photo from 1872. And one of the states that had the most, had 50% of their people who were running the state government at the time was in South Carolina. And South Carolina had more slaves or enslaved people than white people at the time because of the production they had. It was like they had a production. Like when you have a production to produce cows and pigs, they had a production to produce Black enslaved people. And through their various methods they used to make that happen, they had the largest number of Blacks in the country living in that state, and they had the largest number of people who would attain positions of power. And it was in those 7 years after slavery, after Civil War, remember at the same time Lincoln was killed, these men were seen as equal to white men, and is that people who were in previous positions of power were not having it. They were just very uncomfortable with it. And that's when we start seeing some of the other things that occurred that will contribute to what is part of the later discussion. If you didn't know, 3 amendments applied to Black people, particularly around Black men, we should say, not Black people, Black men, even though the 13th Amendment said there will be no more slavery, so that does apply to women. The 14th Amendment applies to the fact that if you're born on American soil, you now are a citizen of America, whether that soil be, even to this day, if you're living in Germany and you're on an army base, you're an American citizen. If you're in the ocean and you're on a Navy ship, and you have a baby, you're an American. If you're in Madison, Wisconsin, and you have a baby in the hospital, you're American. So the 14th Amendment no matter is applied here that said this is how we decide who's a citizen of this country by birth. And the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote because Black women, Black and white women were not allowed to vote for a variety of reasons. But again, men were seen as head of household, men were seen as a breadwinner, men were seen in leadership roles. And so therefore, Black men were attaining the same, were trying to attain or had attained some of the same power status or patriarchy. Not saying I'm endorsing patriarchy here, but patriarchy and the whole idea of man being head of household was real at this time. We also at this, we've already talked about the social construction of race, but after this Reconstruction period, and after the fact that some people knew that they were free, and they in their mind had embraced that they were deserving of citizenship, there was a case that also decided for the next 60 or plus years after 1896, what was going to be the legal construction of race. And the legal construction of race goes to the Plessy v. Ferguson case in 1896, which established that even though Plessy was a Black person who appeared to be white, because if you know anything about Omi and Wynant, who is one of those sociological scholars who talks about this issue of how we identify race, and many times we identify race by just looking, Plessy looked white. If you just looked at him in passing, he looked white. But because he had 0.818 of any drop of Black blood in him, the courts decided that person was Black. And anyone with 1/8 drop of blood in their system, they will be seen as Black. And so that's what set up this whole idea of legal segregation, in that they decided we will decide that you can have the same facilities, same drinking fountain. You can have access to a drinking, not say same. You have the access to a drinking fountain. You have access to a theater. You have access to a bathroom, but it's going to be labeled for whites only or for colors only. And that will be how we will move forward and operate in this world. And so there was a separate but equal decision made. And so it was legal segregation that occurred at that time. And so that men who were now feeling that they were equal with their white counterparts were put in a place of, oh, I'm not equal. And I have to figure out how to navigate the world because the federal government has said that we are going to maintain this separation. Now, states can decide not to do it, but in Southern states where they did believe that was something they wanted to do, they did do it. They definitely promoted it. Another significant and major reason, also issue about manhood, is this. It begins here in 1910 with this person here. I don't know how many of you know him. He's Jack Johnson. And Jack Johnson is very, very much a pivotal point in how we look at Black manhood or Black masculinity. It was during this period of time that the KKK were starting to become a reality. It was during this period of time that there was rumors about the fact that Black women were highly hypersexual and that they were not a group of, they were because of their hypersexuality of Black women, that Black men would often stray out of their homes to have sex with white women. And this particular boxer, whose name was Jack Johnson, at the time was the heavyweight champion of the colored boxing world. But he was also someone who dated white women, and he did it very publicly. He was also someone who became what we now know as the heavyweight champion of the world because he boxed a white man. And he's also where this term, the Great White Hope, comes from because they wanted their white hope to be the one to destroy Jack Johnson. And Jack Johnson knocked him out and became this big time celebrity around the world to the point that he had to flee to Europe because of his outward appearance of dating white women. And he was accused of kidnapping a white woman who he was dating of her own free will and eventually married, to where the federal government again put into practice something called the Mann Act, that if a Black man was caught with a white woman, that he should be jailed for a period of time and treated in a different way. And also this particular act promoted more of the KKK, saying that we need to not allow Black men to have the same power as us, because this issue of power was very uncomfortable to the many other white men at this time, because remember, they owned these people. And this issue was not something that maintained itself only in the South. It maintained itself all over the country, depending on where you were. Chicago is a good example of that, which is also very segregated. Milwaukee is a very good example of that, which is also very segregated, because there's this fear that has been promoted over these years, 400 years to be exact, 401 years now, 402 years now to be clear, that Blacks are less than, and Black men in particular are to be feared. And that comes from this history of where we are. So the Mann Act was instituted about the whole idea of kidnapping white women. And Jack Johnson did go to jail. Once he came back to America, he did go to jail, and that was problematic. But again, this was a very pivotal time around the establishment of Black men as hypersexual, hyper-aggressive, not to be trusted. And a movie came out that also promoted this, which was The Birth of a Nation in 1915, and was promoted by the president at the time. Woodrow Wilson had a screening of it and said it was the best movie ever produced. So it was these types of acts that allowed the whole idea of how do you define what Blackness is, what does it mean to be a Black man, what does it mean to be a Black woman, right? At this particular time, Black women were seen as being hypersexual, Black men were seen as being hypersexual and aggressive and assertive and lazy and not having any dignity. And there's a lot of readings, a lot of writings about how they were seen as this time period was going on. The one book that I'm going to recommend, if I recommend any book that everyone gets to read, is 400 Souls, that just came out last week. I've already read the whole book, which I'm not a reader, but I'm someone who could not stop engulfing all of the information about what is American history through the lens of Black people who have written about our journey. So we go now to 1940s, and we're getting closer to where we are now. And there was another opportunity after, while people were going through this whole idea of de jure segregation, the whole idea that Black people were still not doing very well economically. At the time and point of 1935, which I skipped over here, we developed into a Social Security Act. That Social Security Act provided services primarily to women and children and those who were elderly and those who were also physically challenged. But it also was a program that provided services or benefits to those who worked. But again, it was more for those who were white women, because many Black women who were working and Black men were working in jobs that did not allow them to even really embrace the benefits of Social Security Act and even the benefits of what was called ADC. Many Black women had to really fight and have their own marches and campaigns to be able to get those services because of the view of Black families. Then we go into 1940s, and many men, Black men in particular, we now still have segregated armies. They weren't allowed to be in the same spaces. So again, if you're looking at your manhood always being seen as you're not as good as the white person, these men come back from the war and they want to take advantage of something that the federal government has made available called the Federal Housing Administration Act, which provides you with a loan. And that loan is going to be a loan that's going to allow you to get a home in the suburbs. And that loan was denied to many Black people. This is when our whole idea of redlining became a reality. And this whole movement, and one of the best books to read about that is Rothstein's book on this whole idea of looking at, I don't have the book in front of me, but Rothstein's book really goes to this issue of how people were denied this benefit. This benefit champions suburban development around the white nuclear family, which is a term that we still use, and that the nuclear family is mother, father, and children, and they're in the same home. And that's when this whole idea of the American dream was being somewhat more promoted and more of an interest in our life. The American dream, in the way we define it, and the dictionaries find the word the way it's a happy way of living that is thought of by many Americans as something that can be achieved by anyone in the U.S., especially by working hard and becoming successful. So meritocracy becomes a reality in our world of how we think about it. And this, what I came across here and how people look at the American dream starting with something as early as before 1945 and moving up to where we are now. We really laid this foundation, as you can see here, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I'm sure you've heard that terminology, but everybody was embracing that. If you just work hard, you will be guaranteed the same things that you'll be guaranteed the same thing that I being those who identify as white are able to get access to. Keeping up with the Joneses is in the 1946 to 1964 period. And then we get even to where we are at this new group called Gen Edge, where the success isn't given, it's earned. So all of the underlying issue is that those who have been given opportunities to be in this country from the point of colonizing it and always having laws and policies promoted or created and to enable them being those who identify as white, to be able to move forward, while those who for 250 years of their being here were enslaved and not seen as human, not seen as citizens, and were challenged. Their citizenship has consistently been challenged until 1968. That's something to think about critically. So how do you mentally wrap your head around that? How do you mentally understand that you are a part of a system that believes you're worthy of being a part of that system? And because we have a way of defining manhood, which has its own problems, people embrace that, and often some may do well, some may not. But I have to admit, based on this particular talk, which is still an evolving talk, this whole idea of what I think of as Afrofuturism, when I think about those who were enslaved and they could envision someone like me who has a PhD, that's Afrofuturism, that they believed that if they just held on through their spirituality, through their community, through their hymns, that at some point there would be a person who could be president, to a person who could be an academic professor, to someone who was able to own a home and work as a plumber and electrician the same way someone else is. That to me is something that has really helped me think about this talk, because of the way we portrayed Black men and women, but also how we position Black men, or how we position men to be in a space of having responsibility for taking care of their family and for maintaining a household is something to really wrap your head around. Some of the more recent discussions around the American dream is that people look at having personal freedom, having basic needs met. This is just from a survey of an article that I was reading that I thought was interesting, that if you look at how people define what is the American dream and what they consider as important in that vision of being in a part of an American dream, freedom is a big deal. And so many people have not had their freedom. And in particular, if you look at Black men right now, 1 in 3 Black males are unfortunately incarcerated. So freedom is compromised for those who don't have an education or may drop out of school is even higher than that. That your chances of someone who is not able to maintain their freedom, and even when you are free, out of an incarcerated system, you still are monitored in some way. And a really good book that just came out also from another good colleague of mine, Reuben Miller, who was at University of Chicago. It's called Halfway Home. I highly recommend you read that. I've only started skimming that. The whole idea that how do we want to define citizenship for those who have done their time in prison? And particularly when we have such a large group of Black men who unfortunately have been incarcerated and their freedom is compromised. And in a state like Wisconsin that has the highest rate of incarceration for Black men, what does that mean for those who are social workers, or those who are legislators, or those who have some ability to make a difference in how people's lives are going to be moving forward? I have a few photos before I continue my talk that I wanted to share from my good friend, Carlos Ortiz, who I mentioned earlier. And when I think about my own childhood as a Black boy, and what I thought of as manhood, I think about my uncle barbecuing. And this is not my uncle, but he definitely looks like someone in my neighborhood who worried about us, who cared about us as kids, who wanted to be sure that we were okay and we went to school, and on Saturday would grill. And that's one of the favorite things I love to do is grill, even though we can't grill right now, even though you could, but you really can't. This is one example of what I think of when I think of Black manhood. But unfortunately, I also think of this right now. I think about the most recent shooting of a young man in Milwaukee who was shot because he was trying to get back property that someone stole from him. But also I think about all the things that have been a part of normalcy for Black people in terms of where they can live and what they can do, what that frustration must be like, the fact that there's so many men that I've interviewed over my lifetime who still have what I would call resiliency, but also have a lot of sense of hopelessness and have somewhat put themselves in a space where they don't see where they can turn because somebody doesn't see them as having the same agency or the deservingness of being considered. But we do consider others by gender, but we don't consider the Black male or the Black father. And often I would even go as far as to say, I don't think we even think of Black men as fathers unless they fit a certain profile in our society. But unfortunately, this is too often a film of a sight that we will see of people being at funerals or having a part of their life being engaged where there's someone in their family is dying. And in Milwaukee and in Wisconsin in particular, another good example is COVID. We had at one point the number of deaths of Black people in Milwaukee, in the country, when they were reporting COVID deaths by race, which I commend Milwaukee for doing that, but it's a reality that we have to acknowledge what has been the history that has promoted some of the things we're seeing now and the lack of opportunity and access, which and not, has not allowed people to still progress in the same way that others can. When we look at our social welfare system, of course, we have a social insurance programs, we have public assistance. With public assistance programs, the majority of them are available to those who have children. Now, we tend to think of family and children as mothers and children. We often don't think of fathers, particularly Black fathers, as being the primary parent for their child. And I have to admit, in my own work as a researcher, I have observed in a variety of spaces where social workers have purposely denied and questioned whether the man really is the father, whether he really is the caregiver of his children. So whether or not we want to acknowledge and decide and talk about that, we have to all challenge whether or not we also have brought into some of the historical foundation of how we view parenting, how we view manhood, how we view Blackness, how we view who's deserving of those programs. With social insurance programs, as I mentioned earlier, they were programs that were often available to white families because they had jobs that were allowing them to have taxes taken out and they could be used for them to, and they were having credits earned for them to get these benefits. But again, that's an issue for Black men who again, in my research are making generally less than $12,000 a year, which is what I'll start having my talk be more aimed at, is not able to often get the advantages of what our social welfare system is based on their positionality as men, but also based on the stereotype or prejudice of those who don't understand that men can be parents, but also can be the main provider of the nurturing that's needed for their children. Historically, this is I should have brought the more recent chart, but historically we have to also acknowledge that when we look at median income by race, Blacks have never been top. They've never done very well. Now, there's a lot more Blacks who are going to college, a lot more Blacks who are in the middle class since 60s. There's a lot more Blacks who are doing well, but data is out there that shows there's something going on. Now, if you believe that Blacks are not doing well because they're just lazy and not wanting to get to a space where they're better off, that's a problem. Because the data the data that I presented shows often there's been federal and state policy that has not allowed for people to move to a space where they're in a good space. But unfortunately, this is the reality that we deal with. When you look at this particular issue in Wisconsin, between the difference between Blacks and whites, we see there's issues of segregation that are very strong. Family structure is an issue based on how people are able to maintain what we consider as the standard role of being a father or a mother. People do buy into, I want to be the breadwinner. I want to be head of household. That's problematic, but that's real. And people endorse that, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. people endorse men playing certain roles that causes some problems. Education is an issue. Some people have access to college. Some people have been part of a predatory um, education system where they thought they were going to get a degree and they just couldn't do it. We already know about the whole idea of student loan debt and who has a lot of those student loan debts. The issue of incarceration, particularly for Black men in a state like Wisconsin. Wages, employment rates, and proximity to jobs. All of this has been well documented by various economists, such as William Darity and Derek Hamilton and Damon Jones. The list goes on and on and on that I've read about to understand who is really deserving and what does deservingness mean when you look at it through an intersectionality lens. Going back to housing, the whole idea of the Negro in the slum area in terms of slum. This is an actual article. It goes back about 80 years in terms of how African Americans were redlined, but also there was covenants where they weren't always well known. But those whole ideas of denying access to home loans. And there's even an article as recent as 2 months ago. 2 months ago, I read an article where they were saying that even those who do assessments of people's homes owned by Black people tend to lower the value of that home. They don't give it the same. If they know the people who own the home are Black, then they tend to give them a lower rating, or they tend to devalue the property that people have. So this is not something that's gone away. And if you as a man, and I'm thinking I will personalize it for a second. If I think of myself and the amount of time I put into my own home, the amount of time I value having a home, as a former child who was homeless for a part of their life, a home means a lot to me because it means it does have that issue of success in some way, but also the fact that if I was to pass this on to my children, that it would be devalued because of their race. I'm not going to be able to provide the same thing to my children that many other people can provide to their children because my race is seen as something that's less than. One of the social welfare programs that I wanted to mention was the one that I've studied the most, and that's child support. Child support is a part of the Social Security Act of 1935, but also child support is part of the 4D system, and it's the one place where you see men. And I tend to look at it through Black men, but it's white men involved and all men of all gender. But I tend to focus on Black men and their interaction with this program because Black men are less economically secure. Who I talk to, they tend to make less than $10,000 a year. And child support enforcement policy provides a lot of services that are important. I definitely think of child support as important for women to get benefits. If the father has income, I definitely believe that he should be sharing that income with the mother. Because that's a joint decision to have a child. Whether it was or not, that still is a decision you made to decide to have a child. But also the child support system, like many welfare systems, in my opinion, are somewhat jaded in that when we often think of welfare, and I don't know what people in this audience do, but I've often asked my students, when you think of welfare, who do you think of? Do you think of your cousin? If your cousin is white, do you think of the person you see on the news who is Black, who is often promoted by the, I was looking for, I'm sorry, I'm not looking right at the screen, but I was looking for some notes I had. But, when we think about the whole idea of who is on welfare, we often don't think of welfare as white. And I think of my own particular training as a doctoral student, and my professor asked the class, who is on welfare? Who participates the most on welfare? And I raised my hand because I had been working for 16 years prior to that as a social worker. So I had my own worldview of who I thought was on welfare. And I raised my hand and I said, Black people, because Black people are poor. And he said, no. And I just have to admit, I was taken aback, like, what does he mean? This professor doesn't know what he's talking about. And he said, how many Black people are in this country and how many white people are in this country? And being a new doctoral student, I didn't know that either because I didn't know statistics or numbers. I didn't think of those because I wasn't interested, but I learned it got to be very important in my life. Once he presented the data and showed me that more white people were using benefits than Blacks, it made me re-examine myself like, wow, I didn't even know that. And I didn't know about this program called child support until my last 3 years of social work as well. And the fact that women who received TANF benefits, but it was AFDC benefits at the time, had to name a father. That was part of their agreement, and that the state was the one who owned the child support order, and the state decided, excuse me again, how much of that child support order did the family get. And that was just fascinating to me, that there was this type of state authority over someone's life like that, and what problems did that potentially cause. The one thing that was interesting about this particular policy as well was that in my days before I became a doctoral student, I was engaged with a project called the Paternal Involvement Project, where we were trying to get fathers to be involved with their children, and it was called the Responsible Father Program, which I'm someone who tends not to use that term anymore, because I don't know why we call fathers responsible when we don't say the same thing about mothers. And so anyway, that's a longer discussion on another paper. But it made me, what I did in that program in Illinois was that I learned that for children whose fathers were not married to the mother, and for children whose mother received AFDC benefits, and there was no paternity established, those children were referred to as bastards in the court system. And that if you wanted to get paternity established done, and if you had a child support issue, you went to, in Chicago in 1993, you went to the court called the Bastard Court. And as a social worker, I was shocked that no one had ever thought that was wrong, that no one had challenged the state that they would allow for courts to be established called the Bastard Court. And bastard is a real term from England, 1619 days, but I thought in 1992 we had come a long way, and we hadn't. So I took the opportunity as a person in charge of this demonstration project to hire attorneys, and I had the attorneys go ahead and file a case to get rid of that. And when you talk about what can people do, like what is the solution? The solution is that you as social workers attend to the ethics and values you're supposed to attend to. And I was attending to the ethic of people being treated with dignity and respect. And I decided to have us sue the state. It was called the Comerford v. Gomez case. You can look it up. And we won. So we won the case, and that case said that you can no longer treat people who were not married in the same, in a way that was not due process or equal. There had to be equal treatment. And that was based on the 14th Amendment of the Constitution that they used that. And so that was the process. So it was said, take it out of the basement where they had the court at was in a police station. So Black men and women had to go through a police station to go downstairs to a courtroom to be able to have something heard about child support or to get a paternity established. And I just thought that was unacceptable. The thing about that case, though, that I want to bring up is I had that case as a social worker in 1993. I was not actively involved. I was just someone who promoted it and was able to find funds to pay the lawyers to do the case. But it wasn't until it was then, as a researcher, I learned about incarceration of people who weren't able to pay child support if they were seen as, and generally the men I saw were very poor men. And that really baffled me. And because of my writings about that in my work and my talks about this, I was involved with another case, and that was the Turner v. Rogers case, where I served as a social scientist who gave them information about child support and how it worked and what my research was telling me, which was a United States federal Supreme Court case, where they were saying you shouldn't lock up people if they had the ability to pay. The Turner v. Rogers case, I was someone who had a center called the Center for Family Policy and Practice. They did an amicus brief that was written by Professor Tanya Brito at the law school at UW-Madison. So I've always been someone who's had a really good relationship with lawyers, and I would recommend people learn that what we're dealing with is law all the time. Because again, I was worried about the positionality of Black men in social services and how they only see them for penalizing them in terms of or denying them access to what they may need for their own agency and well-being. And so that case also was a case where I won't say we won. They wanted to also have them provide lawyers to those families, but that didn't happen. But the one thing they did say was that you needed to provide, you needed to be able to show the person, you needed to be able to prove the person didn't have the ability to pay before you decided incarceration was what should happen. And a lot of that's based on what these numbers you see here. If you look at the arrears for the 4D system, which is those who are generally poor or making less than $30,000 a year, a little, maybe slightly more than that, but these are not families who are making a lot of money. This is money owed to the government or owed to the mother. I know in my own research, a lot of the money that was owed to the state was also interest. That's a whole nother discussion as well. But these numbers, for political reasons, drive some of the things I'm talking about. Walter Scott was someone who was gunned down because of his child support issues, because he did not want to be incarcerated again. He was somebody involved with his family. But then the whole idea of surveillance of Black men is a real issue. And something I have written about as well was Walter Scott, and talked to a lot of newspapers and people all over the country and even in the world about that topic. Because we don't often look at Black men as parents. We don't often think of their agency. And the one way you get services is through your parenthood here. I'm going to move ahead because we're running out of time, and I want to see if there's any questions people want to have. The other thing is that with the policy I mentioned earlier, is that that policy did not become a reality till 25 years later. In that just 3 years ago, that basement that I discovered where people were getting their paternity established, they now are in the same court as those who are parents who are middle class and upper middle class. They're all getting the same services. It took 25 years. I started in 1993. It didn't happen until 2017 that they finally moved everybody to the same place. So if you're talking about what can I do, you have to be willing to go in it for the long haul, and you have to stay on top of it. Black men have been seen through research as being the best dads and most involved dads of all. They tend to be with their kids, as this picture here is showing, that we have to look at where they are. They tend to be someone who's trying to figure out ways to do what they can with the minimum amount of resources they have. And in terms of the American dream too, we find that employment for Blacks is still not as high as those who have less than a high school degree. Black unemployment is extremely high and problematic. White high school dropouts have lower unemployment rates than Blacks who have completed a college degree. And this is based on Black men and white men. That's the comparative group by gender, work done by William Darity and Derek Hamilton, which is problematic, that we tend to devalue the worth of that same type of labor. Another thing in terms of the American dream, we have found through work done by Raj Chetty, which is really my last slide because I wanted to see if there's any questions or comments or thoughts. Racial disparities are real, and we're finding that in the work done by Raj Chetty, that, and I mentioned earlier, that Black boys in the same neighborhood as white boys, and parents who have the exact same type of jobs, same income, and maybe even the same wealth, are still doing not as good as their white counterparts. And it was focused on Black boys and Black young men. There was a major discussion about young women as well. But based on his work, he found that for some reason, Black males, because we tend to be concerned about power so much in this country, we're just not being provided the same opportunities. And also what Raj Chetty is finding is that when we look at the American dream, for many people is not real anymore. That many parents want their children to make more, if not the same as them, if they've been what we deem as successful. And successful can be that they're able to have a home and have a job that's rather consistent, and they're able to have a car and whatever that may mean. But we're seeing that less than 40%, he's finding at least less than 40% of children are able to be in the same place as their parents. In closing, some of the things that I would recommend is that, particularly for social workers, and I say this to my students in my classes, one, recognize that men are parents. One, recognize that this child has a father, whether or not, and recognize your own fears around Black men in particular. If you're someone, and that's for Black and white women, and white men and all people. I think we need to recognize our fears around who we're working with. Because I think that that's one of the issues. We need to understand we need to also, because the one place that you will see the most involvement in social welfare is Black men in child support, understand the child support system and what it does and how it could be helpful or harmful to a family. Many states are trying to do a better job and recognizing some of the challenges that Black men face. But we don't have any race data except in the state of Wisconsin on who accesses this system and what the effects of them are. But we need to have more states have race data on how that works. And we're in a space in Wisconsin where we have some of the best research on child support. We need to understand the whole incentive structure of a child welfare system as well as a child support system and what effects that has on Black men and their families. And we need to also just recognize that Black lives matter, that Black men are engaged in their families, that Black men are deserving of the same opportunities that their counterparts are receiving. And I want to say with that, in closing, thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I know we only have 8 minutes, but I would love to hear feedback or comments or other areas you would love to hear more about in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Pate. Yeah, there are a couple questions. I think people want to make sure they have some of the books and info you cited. So just to make sure, you mentioned Halfway Home by Reuben Miller.
Yeah, the book is, I'm going to get up for a second. I'm looking right at the book.
Okay.
The book is Halfway Home. It's by Reuben Jonathan Miller. It just came out just last week. It's an excellent book. It's called Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration. I highly recommend it. If you do any work with men who have been incarcerated, he has taken a 15-year journey in writing this book, and it's fabulous. Just a little bit, I've heard him talk about it. It's gotten very good reviews from NPR and others. Even Matthew Desmond, who wrote the book Evicted, did a really good talk with him on it last week, and I highly recommend it.
And then the other one, 400 Souls.
400 Souls, which
just came out
right here. Mm-hmm. 400 Souls. Another great book. Ibram Kendi, who wrote the book How to Be Anti-Racist, and Keisha Blaine. Keisha Blaine and Ibram Kendi wrote this, have commissioned, work with, I think it's at least 90 or 70, maybe 70 different authors. And you can read at least 10 pages a night and get almost 40 years of history every time. It's just unbelievably good and easy and very accessible. And I am not a reader, so I definitely would recommend it. Another book I would recommend that I taught from, but really it's a book that I've been leaning on. It's called The Man Not. It's a book by Tommy Curry, and it's Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. I would highly recommend that book as well.
And then I think someone had clarified another book, The Color of Law, which I think.
Yeah, The Color of Law. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Color of Law.
So just that one. And then someone had a question about the data and statistics about current welfare participants to guide future program eligibility and funding. I work in housing assistance, and often the stats of Black female single parents are used. And now I'm questioning the validity. Could it be that Black men and women on programs have the Black woman in the household apply for assistance because the system sees them as more worthy? Do you feel there is an underreporting or misreporting in data for this reason?
I'm trying to understand the question. So she says, is there a misreporting of data on Black women or Black men?
Black women.
I'm trying to understand
I believe. Yeah.
Black women. Because the services for most, at least from my understanding, most housing services are primarily for parents, but the parents tend to be women. So I would be surprised if it was underreporting. And also many Black men can't be in housing programs if they've had any kind of incarceration experience, correctional experience. And unfortunately, the number of Black men with corrections experience is very high. So I'm not sure if she could send me, can I put my email? How do I put my email? If she could send that to me directly, I would love to get involved. I would love to talk to her and get back to her with an answer. I don't want to just give her the wrong answer right now.
Yep, you can
should I put it in the Q&A or?
Yeah, you could put it in the Q&A. Another question. Thank you. Part of what was so helpful is your race, class, and gendered analysis and their intersections of pre-1900 history. Would you consider writing that history book targeting middle school students? Somebody's looking to give you some work.
The answer is no. Right now.
Y'all didn't hear all those titles at the beginning? He is a busy man.
I'm kind of busy right now, and that's very thoughtful that they would do that. But the thing that's kind of unfortunate for me, I feel when I do this, is that you would think that people know this, but I study it, and I study it intimately all the time. And they should know this in middle school. They should know it from grade. They should know it from the beginning of their education on history. Just what are some of the foundational issues that compromises people's citizenship and has compromised their citizenship to this point, and now is ingrained in the lexicon of who we are. It's in the soil, it's in our day-to-day. So when people look at me, they see a different, they see something that they're fearful of or not. That's unfortunate, but it's not because they were born that way. It's just that it's what they were born into. And it's what the culture is. So yeah, I think it would be great to do that, but I can barely write what I need to write.
And I had a question about a little bit about the child support and child welfare system. I wonder how much of your work is based around like some of the fatherhood initiative programming that I know Milwaukee has a couple of different programs that focus on this, but wondering if kind of like the effectiveness of those programs and kind of, build those up as like possibilities for child welfare. Because I think I read a study once that for a lot of Black men, like the things that tend to benefit them when they're involved in child welfare specifically is if the child welfare worker is a male, is Black, if the kids are older, and it usually doesn't happen until after they've already been removed, which kind of is like nothing like how the child welfare system operates now. You usually don't have all of those dynamics working all at once. So if you've seen success, or do you promote like people starting like fatherhood initiative programs and what that
yeah, I mean, I definitely think, I'm someone who started fatherhood programs back in the 90s, and that was the way I got to where I'm at now. So I definitely believe fatherhood programs are important. I get concerned how much fatherhood programs endorse some things around misogyny and patriarchy that doesn't really enable Black fathers to be able to do that. I'm not saying they should do that. It's just that you minimize their role to be a breadwinner, and fathers do so much more. And I know so many Black fathers Black men in particular, who make less than $10,000 or $12,000 a year, who are very engaged in the lives of their children, but is not financially engaged. And also because they're unfortunately sometimes forced to be in the shadows, because if they're very visible, she'll lose her benefits that she does have, that society has decided she's entitled to. And I do believe that we should have a social welfare system, but we have a social welfare system that even our current social welfare system does allow you to engage with the father, but often states will choose not to do that, or politicians will say, no, they should work. So I think that it's a bigger discussion. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time, but I have seen some results from studies that make a difference. But to be honest, most of the results on fatherhood programs is that they don't work. That's been the best part of fatherhood programs that say they work is that they allow for you to have peer support groups where men get together and they talk to each other about their issues, and they get to see that, oh, I'm having the same thing you're having. But then it also depends on who the fatherhood director is. Like a person like Al Holmes, who I know who lives in Madison but works in Milwaukee, he's done fatherhood work for years. And I will talk to him because he understands the nuances of what it means to be a father and the issues of poverty. And then also he's someone who understands blackness and Black men. And not everybody does a good job at that. And I get very nervous and concerned. And also the programs are funded through child support. And their main goal is, I want to get paid. I want to get, they may not say that, but I will challenge them to that because I will challenge them because the law states their primary goal is to be reimbursed from a mother who has received, to be reimbursed from a parent, by a parent, if the other parent of their child received TANF or AFDC benefits. That's the law. And that law they can't ignore. So they have to do that. And so if your main goal is to get him to go to work, that's good. But that work means that he will have his check garnished, which means he has less money, but you get your money. And maybe the mom will get some money too, but it hurts the mother and the child to see the father, if they have a good relationship, be put in jail, lose his license, lose a lot of other things that he needs for his own well-being. And that's the reality. And I think it's a big issue that people are not studying or looking at through that lens. They're only looking at he should pay. Well, that's a part of it. I think every father wants to do that. Many fathers want to do that, but also this particular system, I think, may also cause more problems by the way they have men and women interact with each other by maintaining these standard breadwinner caretaker roles when women or men are both, particularly Black women and men, are doing both of them all the time because of the way they have to work their schedules.
And then there was a quick one on, do you know the likelihood for low-income non-custodial fathers who have difficulty in complying with child support payment to end up being incarcerated due to failure to pay child support?
Well, I've written a couple of articles on that, and what I've seen is that it depends on, in Wisconsin, for example, it depends on the county. Milwaukee would probably be less likely to do that, where a county like Madison may not be. There's also counties like Racine and Kenosha where locking someone up is a real issue because they feel that'll be an incentive to get someone to pay. Now, remember, when someone is locked up for this type of benefit, due to the fact that they haven't paid their child support, they still accumulate debt while they're incarcerated. They accumulate interest while they're incarcerated, and they may be reincarcerated upon release if they have another order because they have another child. So it gets to be complicated. So it doesn't happen as frequently as I think it does, but it does happen. And in Wisconsin, if you're behind by 120 days of non-payment, which is about 4 months, so particularly think about now, a warrant goes out for your arrest. Also, another issue about child support is at the federal level, when everybody was getting stimulus checks, this was the one place besides those who were immigrants where if you had a stimulus check coming to you and you owed child support through the state, you didn't get your check. The state kept it. It was one of the few groups in the country where that happened. And because so many people who are poor are Black and brown people, they were more likely not to get that check, which could have been used to help the mother or the child or the father to do what they could to maintain their agency. Mm-hmm. So we have to figure out why is that we have such visceral feelings about men, particularly Black men or poor men. But it's an intersectional look that we have to continue to have again. So again, thank you for the opportunity. Hopefully you learned something today and you thought about something, but I would ask people to critically think about this as they move forward in their work.
And thank you so much, Dr. Pate. This was amazing. So happy we all got to be here to hear you speak today. So thank you again. Just a reminder for people, our closing session starts at 1:45. So please take a few moments to take care of yourself, stretch, move around, whatever you need to do. I did share the link to the closing session in the chat, so hopefully you all can see that. I just want to again thank everybody for being a part of this event, and for your hopefully ongoing commitment and efforts to confront racial injustice. Again, please watch for an email with a link to complete an evaluation for today's presentation, and then a separate email for your CEU if you requested them when you registered. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Pate.
Well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me, Bethany. I forgot to give you, you were the one who encouraged me to do this. So I don't know if I should be happy or mad at you, but thank you for inviting me.
Well, I saw you at, I don't know if others saw the NASW conference a couple months ago, and you were on that big panel. You got to speak for 5 minutes. And I was like, oh no, we got to hear more from Dr. Pate. So I was like, yep, I put a pin in that. So
okay. Well,
really
thank you for inviting me.
We were able to make that. Yep.
Well,
so thank you.
Thank you.
Thing.
Take care.